Hi there, I'm Jim Zirin. Welcome back to more Conversations in the Digital Age. Our show is about international trade policy in the Trump era. From 1947 to 2001, the American economy grew annually at a rate of 3.5%. China's at 7.5%. In 2001, China joined the World Trade Organization and began exporting low-priced goods to the United States at normal tariff rates comparable to those of other nations. Our annual growth rate has now shrunk to 1.5%, while China's stands at 6.7%. Is there a connection? The jury is still out. During the campaign, Donald Trump evoked a seething anger among working-class white Americans, claiming that China had stolen American jobs and had cheated on trade and the global economy. His answer was to impose a 45% tariff on China-made goods. Our question today is, how does the Trump trade doctrine differ from that of President Obama and Hillary Clinton, and how effective will it be in reviving a sluggish economy? Here to discuss these questions is Robert Hormats. Bob Hormats was a partner at Goldman Sachs International. He served as Undersecretary of State for Economic Growth, Energy, and the Environment in the Obama administration under Hillary Clinton. He's now a vice chairman of Kissinger Associates. Bob Hormats, I'm delighted to welcome you to the program.
Well, Jim, thanks for inviting me.
Well, I'm delighted to see you here. Now, Bob, what is the power of the President of the United States in the domain of trade?
The President has enormous powers in the area of trade. There are many areas in which the President's powers are constrained by checks and balances. For instance, he can't raise taxes without the Congress. He can't do a number of other things in the fiscal area without the Congress. So the Congress does have a lot of checks over the President. But in the area of trade, the power of the purse, primarily. But in the area of trade, over the course of a century, the Congress has delegated enormous discretionary powers to the President. 1917, the Trading with the Enemy Act, that permitted the President to do almost anything, cutting off trade or raising tariffs in the event of emergency. Then, a number of years later, the Congress did the same thing. 1977, they changed or modified the Trading with the Enemy Act, which still exists, by the way, to create what's called the International Economic Emergency Powers Act, which again, if the President finds an emergency, can do a variety of things to raise tariffs. And then there are various other provisions in the 1970s that under certain circumstances give the President the ability to raise tariff. And on NAFTA, the President has the power after 6 months to, in effect, withdraw from NAFTA and impose a tariff, as he threatens to do, on Mexico. He's proposed a 35% tariff.
He doesn't like Mexico. North American Free Trade Agreement is NAFTA.
NAFTA is the North American Free Trade Agreement. He says it's the worst trade agreement ever. He has tended in his campaign to exaggerate a variety of trade issues and to threaten to take action, punitive action, against countries, particularly Mexico and China. And he has the ability to do a lot of things without recourse to the Congress.
Well, let's focus on China, where he said he would impose a 45% tariff. I mean, this is really strange to a Republican, because Republicans traditionally have been a low tariff party. But does he have the power to impose a 45% tariff? And if he did, would that be sound policy?
Well, under certain circumstances, if he found some kind of emergency, balance of payments, for instance, he might well be able to do it in the first instance, but there'd be a lot of repercussions that he would have to think through before he chose to take that kind of highly extreme action. First of all, the Chinese would take the United States to the World Trade Organization and say this was done in a way that was totally contradictory to the rules of the WTO.
Discriminated against them.
Discriminating against China. Second, a lot of American companies that import goods from China, including the various retailers that sell a lot of Chinese goods, would then go to court and say the president had exceeded his powers. Third,
well, would that kind of suit be successful? Doesn't
the problem is
the Congress?
The problem is that the courts, by and large, have been very reluctant to challenge the president when he finds an emergency. For instance, the president of the United States, Franklin Roosevelt, used the Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917 to justify the imposition of a tax holiday when he became president in the early 1930s. Nixon used the Trading with the Enemy Act to justify, as one of many legal devices to justify imposing a 10% tariff on our allies. So there are a variety of ways in which the president can use that, as well as what I mentioned, also the 1977 International Economic Emergency Powers Act. So the challenge would be hard, but they would make the challenge, and they would certainly have a court challenge. The third is that the Chinese are tough customers. They have very strong nationalistic feelings. They would be very resentful of being pushed around, and they would take some action, not just going to the WTO, but if the president imposed this unilaterally, they would do certain things adverse to the interests of the United States.
So what could they do to us?
Well, they could do a variety of things. They could push way back. There's a lot of American investment in China. They could push back on that. They could do a lot of things that would be negative from the point of view of American companies that have invested in China. They could also stop buying a lot of things from the United States. Admittedly, they have a trade surplus with the United States, but a lot of American companies rely on sales to China.
Like Boeing. Boeing sells them airplanes.
We sell them airplanes, we sell them a lot of high-tech equipment, we sell them a lot of sophisticated equipment. So some of the very top-end American companies would find themselves in a position where their market access could be cut back quite dramatically, and it would really cause a series of negative implications. In addition, the Chinese market, because they were selling less goods to the United States because of what Trump did or threatened to do, would then react in a negative way. And we saw what happened when the Chinese market went down to the American stock market. So a lot of American pensioners, people who own stock here, would be adversely affected. And the other is our allies in Asia don't want to have a fight between the United States and China. And the last is that if you cut goods off from China or cut them down, where are American companies who buy those goods going to go? If you're buying T-shirts from China or cups from China or electronic equipment from China, you're going to find some other low-cost market, Bangladesh or Vietnam or Malaysia or Thailand or a variety of other
Or the
countries.
impact on the American consumer. I mean,
Yes.
a $5 T-shirt would now cost
The
$7.50.
American consumer would be adversely affected, or the buyers, the retailers who buy from China, would find some other place to get that stuff. And there are plenty of other countries that would be delighted to produce more of the T-shirts and cups and electronic equipment, so that while it might reduce our trade deficit with China, it might not reduce our aggregate trade deficit because some other countries would supply those products. There are issues with China for sure, but the question is, how do you deal with them? The US and China for years have been having negotiations on intellectual property protection, on protection of trade secrets. This has been going on under various administrations, the Obama administration, the Bush administration before that. So these are not new issues.
But Trump and his advisors would say we've been weak in those negotiations, and they've been able to cheat and steal American property, intellectual property, or else if they buy our goods, it's on condition that we have a Chinese partner and that we share technology with them and trade.
Well, there are numerous issues that have come up about how much you have to trade with your partner or provide intellectual property to your partner in China. These have been going on for a while. I don't think it's accurate on the part of Trump to say that the American negotiators have been weak. I think American negotiators have done a lot to try to get this, and I think there has been progress in some aspects on intellectual property, software. There has been progress. If you talk to software companies, there's a lot less of a problem than there was. There's still some problems between the two. President Obama and President Xi have discussed these, and it's not wrong to say that we should continue to try to find answers with the Chinese, but the question is, if you think, or if the president-elect thinks that he can browbeat the Chinese or coerce the Chinese or threaten the Chinese to do what we want. This is a big country with very strong nationalistic feelings of its own, and it'll be very hard for him to get the kind of results, and to threaten them with a 45% tariff will make these nationalistic impulses that exist in China all the stronger. So we
have no bilateral trade agreement with China,
no, we don't.
We never have had.
We never have had. That's one of the problems with this whole debate. It's gotten morphed together. The anti-TPP arguments, the Trans-Pacific Partnership,
to which China was not going to be a party.
China is not a negotiating partner. There are 12 countries who were negotiating partners.
That was supposed to curtail China.
Yeah, including Japan, a number of countries. They're in the negotiation. China is not, and the idea was to try to develop a close set of trade ties with countries in the Pacific area to give them a high standard of trade relations with the United States. It was not necessarily anti-China, but it was meant to be a sort of a counterweight to demonstrate that the United States had its own friends and allies in the region. China, by the way, while we're negotiating TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, they're negotiating something called Regional Cooperation Economic Partnership, RCEP. So if we leave the playing field on TPP, the Chinese are still going to be on the playing field negotiating an agreement with their trading partners. So whatever we do with China, whatever position we take on these issues, we have to remember they're a big country, they're a powerful country, they're not going to succumb to bullying or threats. It's going to have to be based on a rational negotiation between two powerful nations. That's the way this is likely to work out, and not the sort of hammering. Because they just are not going to. We're not talking about negotiating with Burundi here. We're talking about negotiating with China. It's a very big difference, and China's a big country with a lot of power, and they will not be pushed around by the United States or anyone else.
And what happens in China doesn't necessarily stay in China and can impact our economy very dramatically.
Yes, I mean, you're correct. If there's a big trade war with China, it will have a major effect on relations across the board. It'll have an effect on the Chinese financial market as well, and of course that will affect our financial market, and a lot of American pensioners who own stocks here will find that will hurt the value of their pensions.
Well, Trump and his advisors argue we're in a trade war already. He says that China is subsidizing their exports. There's a China price. China is dumping goods at costs or prices that are lower than the cost of manufacture in the United States. And what's the answer to that?
Well, the answer is that if that is the case, and there have been cases brought against China, not just in the United States, but in Europe as well, on steel, you can go to the World Trade Organization, they get a hearing, and if there are dumping cases that prove to be valid, then the World Trade Organization allows you to take remedial action to offset that dumping. So it's not as if there are no rules. There are rules, and the United States has availed themselves of those rules. The United States has gone to the World Trade Organization and tried to get redress where there are issues that it has with the Chinese. And we're not the only ones. The Europeans have done the same thing. So there are a set of rules that do help us to address the kind of concerns that Trump and others are talking about. But they've been used before. They can be used in the future.
China joined the World Trade Organization, but yet they were charging the highest tariffs around.
They joined the World Trade Organization actually for two basic reasons. One was that it enabled them to get greater access to foreign markets, and they have been doing that. They're very competitive. We have to face it. They are a very competitive country, not just because of low wages, but they're moving up the technology ladder, and they're becoming more competitive in a wider range of goods. But the other thing is, very cleverly, Premier Zhu Rongji, who was the premier at the time, understood that they needed to make internal changes in China. In other words, once they joined the WTO, they had to subscribe to all the rules of the WTO, and they had to deregulate various parts of their economy and change the rules, and that enabled them to become much more efficient internally, to break down some of these constraints to competition within the Chinese market. That also enabled them to be more competitive. They're a very competitive economy, but if you go back to the early 70s, and other countries who surged onto the global market became more competitive. China now, though, is in a somewhat different situation. Wages are going up a lot in China, particularly in eastern China, something like 15% per year, according to my Chinese colleagues who I talk to, friends I talk to. Their wages are going up. So over a period of time, if you look at China, they're going to be less competitive in a wide range of manufacturing products.
Because other Asian countries can manufacture for less.
Other Asians can manufacture for less. And they don't have the advantage that we have of low-cost power either. So if you look at China, their ability to compete has diminished, in part because of wages going up, in part because of the high cost of power. And you're seeing a number of American companies on their own who want to address the competition issue and want sort of shorter supply chain, so to speak, moving some production back here. The big difference, however, is that a lot of the goods that we produce here that could have been produced in China or were produced in China in the past can be produced here again. The problem is that with productivity and with new technology, it takes fewer workers to produce them. That's the bigger problem. The jobs issue in this country is, to a degree, adversely affected by foreign competition, not just from China, but from a wide range of other countries. And they do hold wages down in certain sectors, the manufacturing sector, for instance. Foreign competition does this. But this didn't start with China. This has been part of a process that's going on. The thing that most people don't realize is manufacturing production has gone down in China as well over the last decade. They have seen a decline in their manufacturing as well, in part because costs have gone up and in part because new technology supplants workers. So it's these technological displacements. The big problem here is we have failed to help Americans who are displaced by foreign competition and displaced by new technology. That has displaced a lot of jobs and hurt a number of people because of the change, globalization, competition, new technology. Our ability to help American workers buffer themselves against this and adjust has really been inadequate. So our big problem is we need to address at home foreign competition pressures from wherever they come and changes from technology wherever they emerge. And we're not doing that. We're not doing that very well, and that requires education. It might require some money to sort of top off wages if they go from a good job to a less good job. We need a much more dramatic...
By education, you mean retooling and
retraining for the newer jobs, and we need to create new companies. The rate of growth of creation of new companies in this country, small businesses, for instance, has diminished very dramatically. The money that goes into R&D, the national labs, has declined very substantially. If we're going to keep up with a competitive world, we're going to have to find ways of addressing our domestic challenges. And if we don't do that, we're going to suffer not just from competition from abroad displacing American jobs, but also from new technologies. So we have to enable our workers to become more competitive and help those workers who find themselves displaced from their jobs or suffer substantial declines in their earnings. We're not going to have a proactive international economic policy, an effective international economic policy, without a much more effective jobs policy and wages policy at home. That's what we've got to deal with.
So you subscribe to the argument of Roger Altman and Richard Haas that our problem is not trade deals, our problem is like NAFTA or even TPP if we entered into it, but the problem has been trade and globalization and losing jobs abroad to trade and technology.
Yeah, our problem is not so much the trade deals, and globalization has certainly had an adverse effect on some parts of the economy, although it's benefited certain others. But the problem is we have not addressed the problems of those parts of the economy that have been adversely affected by trade or trade deals or by the surge in new technology. We're going to have to figure out how to do this because we are seeing the hollowing out of the middle class. There are people who are understandably upset at globalization. They feel left behind by globalization, adversely affected. Certain companies do very well, lots of companies don't. That's one of the problems. And we have to help particularly small businesses. We need to find ways of giving them better financing, finding a whole new set of measures to help small businesses to thrive, including a tax cut. There are proposals now to lower the business tax on unincorporated businesses, that is to say, LLCs, individual proprietary ownership companies.
Mom and pa stores.
Yes, and to lower that, and the House Ways and Means Committee has a proposal to lower that to about 15%.
What you haven't mentioned, Bob, is our indebtedness to China. China holds about 10% of our public debt to the tune of about $1.24 trillion. Do we have to take that into account in a trade war?
I think we have to take into account, but the probability the Chinese are going to dump that debt, as some people suggest, is highly unlikely in so far as it would push the dollar down, it would push the RMB, the yuan, their currency up. That would hurt them. They have a substantial amount of money, as you correctly point out, in dollars. The dollar would go down, so the value of their reserves would go down.
But the presence of the debt reduces our economic leverage in any negotiation.
It does, but I think it's a retaliatory measure the Chinese are not likely to use because it would have an adverse effect on them as well as
we also have the problem that we want to enter into negotiations with them about the South China Sea to reduce tensions. We want to enter into negotiations with them to bring pressure on Korea. Trump himself said during the campaign that he was going to get China to make North Korea come to the table and discuss their nuclear arsenal. And if we want to do that and have a productive relationship with them, how can we do it at the same time we're in a trade war?
Well, I think having a trade war with them would certainly make it more difficult to have these kinds of conversations. Traditionally, we've been able, most of the time, to separate economic issues that we have with the Chinese from national security and political issues, but there obviously would be some spillover. The Chinese have an interest, as do we, in a non-nuclear North Korea because it's a threat not only to us, which is certainly a threat to the U.S., it's probably the most dangerous problem that the new president will face on day one. And you need to work with the Chinese to deal with it. So he needs to do that. It wouldn't be such a good idea to have a trade war going at the same time you're trying to do this, although I suspect the Chinese interest and our interest on North Korea would continue to be a topic of some measure of convergence over time if it gets worse in North Korea, and it seems to be getting worse now as they...
It's dangerous.
It's dangerous. Not only do they have nuclear capability, but they're now developing their rocket technology so that they can deliver that nuclear capability longer distance.
Even to the continental United States.
Yes, they can, and this is dangerous because you have an unstable regime. The Chinese know this. The Chinese have not been sitting back and doing nothing. They've had a long series of conversations with the Koreans going way back, but they have not been able to get the Koreans to necessarily agree. And the Chinese also are concerned a collapse of the government in North Korea, in their judgment, could lead to instability in the Korean Peninsula. It could lead to the South, in effect, taking over the North, or it could lead to a massive number of North Korean refugees coming into China, none of which the Chinese want, or the United States employing these THAAD missiles.
Right.
Chinese don't want that either.
Okay, unfortunately we're running out of time, but I have a question for you, Bob Hormats, If you were advising President Trump, what would you advise him to do about fixing the global economy?
I think he's got to do two basic things. One, he's got to reinstate a strong trade relationship with our traditional friends and allies, the Japanese, the Koreans, and the Europeans.
Okay, strong trade relationship.
And that means trying to develop some trade agreements, whatever you call them, to enhance the values of openness, of competition in the global trading markets and get as many friends and allies as he can. And second, he's got to work with these emerging economies. They have broader and broader global interests. They need a stable global economy. Even though many of them don't see everything eye to eye with us, because of the breadth of their relations around the world, they need the global economic order to work. And we've got to figure out a way of making it work. If it starts deteriorating, fragmenting, moving into protectionism, deteriorating into xenophobia and economic nationalism, that won't help. That'll hurt us, certainly, because we're a big trading country. It'll hurt them also because they're big trading countries.
No xenophobia. Bob Hormats, thank you so much for coming by.
My pleasure.
Sorry we ran out of time because this has just been great. I wish we could do it for another hour.
Love to do it again. Anytime.
We will do it again.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you for coming by. Tune in next week for more conversations in the digital age. Take care and all the best.